The radar screen showed nothing but static where 6 aircraft should have been. Major Wesley Kincaid leaned forward in the operations center, his coffee gone cold in his hand, staring at the green phosphor glow that refused to make sense. 6 A-10 Thunderbolt IIs had crossed into contested airspace over the Kandahar ridgeline at 600 hours. By 6:45, 5 had disappeared from every screen, every satellite feed, every ground observer's binoculars. The silence from the radio channels was absolute, the kind of quiet that made veteran controllers reach for cigarettes they'd quit years ago. Then, at 7:12, a single blip appeared, crawling across the display like a wounded animal dragging itself home. The transponder signature was unmistakable: Warthog 6, call sign Gravedigger. The aircraft was barely holding altitude, trailing something the radar couldn't quite interpret: smoke, fuel, pieces of airframe, maybe all three. Kincaid grabbed the microphone, his knuckles white. "Gravedigger, this is Overwatch Actual. State your condition." The response came through layers of static, a voice so calm it was almost disturbing against the backdrop of what sounded like a cockpit tearing itself apart. "Overwatch, Gravedigger. I'm coming home. Clear the pattern." It was Captain Myra Vasquez, and every controller in the room knew what that meant. The woman they'd nicknamed Ice during her first deployment, not because she was cold, but because nothing seemed to crack her. She'd flown supply runs when everyone else wanted combat glory, volunteered for the dawn patrols nobody else would take, and somehow always brought her plane back. But she'd never been given the hard missions, the ones that made reputations. Until today, when someone had decided 6 aircraft weren't enough without her. Now 5 were gone, and she was the only one returning. The operations center erupted into controlled chaos. Ground crews scrambled. Fire trucks positioned themselves along the runway. Medical teams stood ready with stretchers and plasma bags. Through the windows they could see it now, a dark speck against the morning sun, trailing black smoke that wrote accusations across the sky. The A-10 was supposed to be ugly, built around a gun so powerful it could shred tanks, armored like a flying fortress. But what was approaching looked like something that had flown through hell and stolen a piece of it on the way out. The left engine was dead. The titanium bathtub that protected the cockpit was scorched and pockmarked, and the vertical stabilizer had a hole in it large enough to see daylight through. Kincaid watched it approach, and one question dominated every thought. What happened up there, and why was she the only one who survived? The A-10 hit the runway hard, too hard, the landing gear screaming under the impact. Sparks shot out from the right wheel as something in the assembly gave way, and the aircraft slewed sideways before Vasquez corrected, the nose lifting slightly before settling again with a grinding sound that made the ground crews wince. Black smoke poured from the left nacelle, and fluid, hydraulic fuel, something vital, streamed behind in a glistening trail. The canopy was spiderwebbed with cracks, the titanium armor around the cockpit charred black, with scorch marks that spoke of impacts from something far more aggressive than small arms fire. Fire trucks followed the wounded Thunderbolt down the runway, foam already spraying. But Vasquez didn't slow down until she'd reached the end, turning the aircraft with her remaining engine onto the taxiway with a precision that seemed impossible given the state of her plane. When she finally shut down the engine, the silence was immediate and profound, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the distant wail of sirens. The canopy cracked open slowly, hydraulics groaning, and Captain Myra Vasquez emerged like a ghost from smoke. Her flight suit was darkened with sweat and something that might have been blood, hers or someone else's, impossible to tell. She climbed down without assistance, waving off the medical team that rushed forward, her movements deliberate and controlled. Her helmet came off, revealing dark hair plastered to her skull and eyes that seemed to be looking at something far beyond the airfield. Major Kincaid was there in seconds, a dozen questions fighting for position behind his teeth. "Captain, what happened up there? Where are the others?" Vasquez looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice carried the same eerie calm it had over the radio, but underneath it was something else, something that made the hairs on Kincaid's neck stand up. "They walked into an ambush, AAA positions that weren't on any intel brief. Surface-to-air missiles, radar-guided Chinese manufacture. They lit us up the moment we crossed the ridgeline. She paused, her jaw tightening. Falcon, Reaper, Boomer, Skid, and Hammer. They went down fighting. I saw Hammer's ejection, but it was over the hot zone. The others, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. The maintenance chief appeared, his face pale as he walked around the A-10, cataloging damage with the expression of a coroner examining a body. Captain, I count 47 impact points. 23 are armor-piercing rounds, the rest are shrapnel. You took a missile proximity blast on the left side. That's what killed the engine. The hydraulics are shot. The flight computer is held together by prayers. And there's a fuel line that should have ignited and turned you into a fireball somewhere over the mountains. Word spread through the base like wildfire, the kind of story that moved faster than official reports. The pilot's ready room went quiet when Vasquez's name was mentioned, the casual mockery that had followed her for years evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. They remembered the jokes about Supply Run Myra, and the pilot who'd never seen real combat, the way she'd been excluded from the Brotherhood because she'd never played the game, never boasted, never fit the mold they expected. Now those same pilots stood in small groups, speaking in low voices, trying to reconcile what they thought they knew with what had just limped back from the mountains. Lieutenant Jeremy Rourke, who'd once made a crack about Vasquez being too careful to be dangerous, found himself staring at the flight manifest from that morning. 6 names, 5 crossed out in red. 1 remaining, written in her neat, precise handwriting at the bottom. M. Vasquez, gravedigger. He'd been in the operations center when the call came in, when her voice had cut through the static with that unnatural calm, and he'd felt something he wasn't proud of, relief that he hadn't been on that mission, followed immediately by shame that he'd ever questioned her. The intelligence officer, Captain Rebecca Strand, was already pulling together the mission recordings, trying to piece together what had happened from the fragmented radio traffic and the sparse data that had made it back. What she found made her reach for a drink she kept locked in her desk for occasions exactly like this. The ambush had been perfect, positioned in a valley where radar coverage was limited and satellite passes were infrequent. Someone had known they were coming, had prepared a killing field with overlapping fields of fire and mobile SAM batteries that could relocate before counter-battery fire arrived. The 5 leading aircraft had flown straight into it, their formations tight, their altitude predictable. They'd followed the textbook, and the textbook had gotten them killed. But Vasquez's flight path was different. She'd been flying rear security, higher and offset, a position usually reserved for the least experienced pilot, a spot where she could observe and learn without getting in the way. That positioning, intended as an insult, had saved her life. When the first aircraft exploded, she'd immediately broken formation, gaining altitude and banking hard, using the terrain to mask her approach. The gun camera footage that survived showed glimpses of what happened next, tight, violent maneuvers that pushed the A-10 to its limits, diving attacks on SAM sites that erupted in secondary explosions, the distinctive BRRRRRT of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon tearing through armor. She'd stayed in the fight for 19 minutes, drawing fire, suppressing positions, giving her squadron mates a chance to eject, to survive, to escape. Only one had made it out, and even then, Vasquez had circled the ejection site, driving off ground forces until her fuel state forced her to break contact. The debriefing room was sterile and cold, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a long table scarred with coffee rings and the weight of countless post-mission analyses. Vasquez sat at one end, still in her flight suit, a bottle of water untouched in front of her. Across from her, Major Kincaid, Captain Strand, and Colonel Marcus Thorne, the base commander, a man whose face was carved from hard decisions and regret. The recording equipment was running, red lights blinking in the corner, preserving every word for the investigation that would inevitably follow. Thorne spoke first, his voice carefully neutral. "Captain, walk us through the mission from your perspective. Take your time." Vasquez's eyes were steady, focused on something in the middle distance. "We launched at 600 six-ship formation. Tasking was close air support for a ground element pushing through the Kandahar ridgeline. Intel brief indicated minimal air defense, small arms, and maybe some outdated shilkas. We crossed the border at 6:23, proceeded to waypoint Alpha without incident. She paused, taking a breath that seemed to cost her. At 6:37, Falcon called rifle and we started our descent into the valley. That's when it happened. I was at 8,000 feet, trailing formation by 2 miles. I saw the first flash, shoulder-fired missile, but the signature was wrong, too fast, too hot. Falcon never had a chance. The explosion was catastrophic mid-fuselage. No ejection. Her voice didn't waver, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the water bottle. Reaper and Boomer tried to break left, but there were more launches coordinated from multiple positions. I counted at least 6 SAM sites, all radar-guided Chinese HQ-7 systems if I'm reading the signatures right. They were tracking us before we even entered the valley. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. Kincaid leaned forward, his expression grim. "You're saying someone leaked our flight plan?" Vasquez met his eyes. "I'm saying someone knew exactly where we'd be and when we'd be there. The positioning was too perfect, the timing too precise. This was a kill box and we flew right into it." She continued, describing her decision to go high instead of low, to use the sun and the terrain to mask her approach. How she'd identified the command vehicle for the SAM network by its antenna configuration, and put 100 rounds of depleted uranium through it, watching it cook off in a fireball that took out 2 adjacent launchers. How she'd seen Hammer's chute deploy, watched him land in a ravine, and made the split-second decision to suppress the area, giving him a chance even though it meant flying through a storm of anti-aircraft fire that turned her plane into a flying colander. The tactical analysis took hours, spreading across whiteboards covered in diagrams and flight paths, overlays of terrain and weapons positions. What emerged was a picture that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. A mission planned with incomplete intelligence, a formation that should never have been sent into that valley, and a single pilot who'd somehow survived through skill, instinct, and a willingness to do what no one else thought was possible. Captain Strand pointed to a specific moment in the timeline, her voice tight. "Here, at 6:52, you should have been out of ammunition. The gun camera shows you made 4 more attack runs after this point." "How?" Vasquez's expression was unreadable. "I rationed. Short bursts, precision targeting. The GAU-8 carries 1,100 rounds. I used 963. Every round had to count because I knew the moment I ran dry, they'd swarm Hammer's position." Colonel Thorne sat back, his fingers steepled under his chin. "You stayed in the fight for 19 minutes alone against multiple SAM sites and what our best estimate says was a battalion-sized element with integrated air defenses. By every tactical doctrine we have, you should have called for support and withdrawn. Why didn't you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Vasquez looked at each of them in turn, and when she spoke, there was an edge to her voice that hadn't been there before. "Because support was 30 minutes out and Hammer would have been dead in 10. Because I took an oath to leave no one behind and I meant it. Because someone had to stay and I was the only one left who could." Thorne nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "The rescue team found Lieutenant Hammond alive, thanks to you. He's in surgery now, but the medics say he'll make it." He told them an A-10 circled his position like a guardian angel, kept the enemy at bay until the Pave Hawks arrived. Vasquez said nothing, but her shoulders seemed to relax fractionally. Kincaid cleared his throat. "Captain, there's going to be a formal investigation. Questions about the mission planning, the intelligence failure, why 6 aircraft were sent into that valley. You're going to be called to testify, probably more than once. But right now, off the record, I need to know, did you see anything else up there? Anything that might tell us who set this up?" Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. There was a vehicle civilian pattern on the ridgeline. Someone was watching, filming maybe. They left before the rescue birds arrived, headed east toward the border. I couldn't engage, couldn't spare the ammunition, but I got a good look. White Toyota Hilux, modifications for rough terrain, probably satellite communications equipment in the bed. The next 3 days were a blur of intelligence assessments, satellite imagery reviews, and the quiet, grim process of notifying next of kin. 4 families received flag-draped coffins. One received a Purple Heart and a promise that their son would be coming home as soon as he was stable enough to fly. The base settled into the heavy atmosphere that follows loss. The empty chairs in the ready room, the gear still hanging in lockers that would never be opened by their owners again, the silence where there used to be laughter. Vasquez moved through it like a ghost, attending the memorial service with the others but standing apart, her dress blues crisp and perfect, her expression locked down so tight that no one could read what was happening behind her eyes. The padre spoke about sacrifice and valor, about the brotherhood of arms and the price of freedom. The words washed over her like rain, meaningless against the memory of 5 aircraft exploding into fireballs, of voices cut off mid-transmission, of a young lieutenant bleeding into the dirt while she'd circled overhead, counting her ammunition and calculating angles, because math was the only thing that made sense when everything else was chaos. After the service, she found herself alone in the hangar where her A-10 sat, surrounded by maintenance crews performing what looked like a complete rebuild. The plane was a mess, every panel marked with damage tags, whole sections of the wing waiting for replacement, the left engine already removed and sitting on a dolly like an amputated limb. Chief Warrant Officer Raymond Torres approached, wiping his hands on a rag that was more grease than fabric. "She's a tough bird, Captain, tougher than we thought. The damage assessment is, well, I've been working on hogs for 20 years, and I've never seen one take this much punishment and still fly. The proximity blast that killed your left engine should have sent shrapnel through the cockpit. Instead, it hit a structural rib at just the right angle, deflected most of it. Another foot to the right, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Vasquez reached out, touching the scarred titanium of the cockpit tub, her fingers tracing an impact crater that hadn't quite punched through. "How long until she's airworthy?" Torres looked at her like she'd asked him to perform a miracle. 3 weeks minimum. And that's if we pull parts from 2 other birds and I let my crew work around the clock. Why? Because I'm going back." Her voice was flat, final, brooking no argument. "Somewhere in those mountains is the answer to who set us up, and I'm going to find it." Colonel Thorne didn't authorize the mission, not officially, but he didn't forbid it either. A careful non-decision that gave Vasquez the space she needed while keeping his hands clean if everything went sideways. The intelligence community was already churning, analysts poring over every byte of data from the ambush, looking for patterns, connections, the fingerprints of whoever had orchestrated the trap. What they found was disturbing. Encrypted communications between local tribal militias and a foreign intelligence service, money transfers through shell corporations in Dubai and Karachi, and a pattern of attacks on coalition aircraft that showed increasing sophistication and coordination. Someone was turning the scattered insurgency into a modern fighting force, and they were doing it with precision and resources that spoke of state sponsorship. Captain Strand cornered Vasquez in the intelligence cell 3 days after the debriefing, spreading satellite photos across the desk like tarot cards reading a dark future. "The Hilux you saw, we found it, or what's left of it. Burned out, stripped, abandoned in a ravine 40 kilometers from the ambush site. But before they torched it, someone was sloppy. We pulled a partial serial number from the frame, traced it back to a batch stolen from a UN convoy 6 months ago. That convoy was supposed to be secured by local contractors, but the security team disappeared the night before the hit. We're looking at a network, Captain, something bigger than we initially thought." Vasquez studied the images, her analytical mind cataloging details, building connections. The ambush site, the escape route, the timing, this wasn't planned in a cave somewhere. This was professional, coordinated, military-grade intelligence, satellite coordination, the works. "We need to find who's feeding them information, and we need to do it before they set another trap." Strand nodded, but her expression was troubled. "That's above our pay grade, Captain. The people investigating this wear suits and carry credentials that make colonels nervous. Your part is done. You survived, you saved Hammond, you brought back intelligence. Let the professionals handle it from here." But Vasquez shook her head, her jaw set. "Those were my squadron mates, my friends." Falcon was going to be a father in 3 months. Reaper was 6 days from finishing his deployment. Boomer had a kid sister who wanted to be a pilot, and he called me once to ask for advice to give her. They died because someone betrayed us, and I will not let that go unanswered. The room went quiet, the weight of her words settling like snow. The investigation expanded, tentacles reaching into places that made commanders nervous and politicians defensive. Questions were asked about operational security, about who had access to flight plans, about the chain of communications that led to 6 aircraft being sent into a valley that intelligence should have flagged as high risk. Vasquez found herself called into meeting after meeting, repeating her story to different faces behind different desks, each one more senior and more skeptical than the last. But the facts didn't change, and neither did the evidence. Someone had leaked critical information, and 5 pilots were dead because of it. 3 weeks after the ambush, as promised, Chief Torres delivered the A-10 back to flight status, the aircraft now bearing the scars of its trial like badges of honor. The replacement panels were slightly different shades of gray. The new engine gleamed against the weathered airframe, and someone, probably Torres himself, had painted 5 small stars beneath the canopy rail, one for each squadron mate she'd lost. Vasquez ran her pre-flight with methodical precision, checking every system twice, her hands moving through familiar patterns that grounded her in the present. The maintenance crew stood at a respectful distance, watching as she climbed into the cockpit, settled into the seat that had become as familiar as her own skin. The Pratt & Whitney engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, the sound building to a roar that vibrated through the airframe. She ran through the checklist, contacted Tower, and received clearance for a local area flight, just a test hop officially to verify the repairs. Unofficially, she had coordinates in her kneeboard that weren't on any approved flight plan, coordinates that marked the ambush site and the surrounding terrain. She was going back, not for revenge but for answers, to see with her own eyes what the satellite imagery couldn't show, to fly the same path and feel what her instincts had been screaming that day. The wheels left the runway at 6:30, the same time as that mission 3 weeks ago, the morning sun painting the same golden light across the same mountains. But this time she was alone by choice, not circumstance, and she was hunting. The flight to the ambush site took 43 minutes, the A-10 cruising at 15,000 feet, well above the range of anything except the most sophisticated SAM systems. Vasquez descended slowly, circling the valley in a wide spiral, her eyes scanning the terrain, looking for anything that seemed out of place. The valley looked peaceful from altitude, a stretch of brown earth and gray rock cut by a seasonal river that was little more than a trickle this time of year. But Vasquez could see the scars if she knew where to look. The blast craters where aircraft had impacted, the scorched earth where SAM sites had been hastily camouflaged and then abandoned, the network of tire tracks that spoke of a well-coordinated withdrawal. She keyed her radio, transmitting on the secure frequency that connected her directly to the intelligence cell. Overwatch, Gravedigger. I'm over the site. Ground shows evidence of recent activity, multiple vehicle tracks heading east and south, counting at least 3 positions where heavy equipment was emplaced and then removed, probably within hours of the ambush. These weren't insurgents with pickup trucks. This was a professional operation with logistics and planning. Captain Strand's voice came back, tight with concern. Gravedigger, you're not authorized for this overfly. Return to base immediately. But Vasquez was already banking, following the tracks, her altitude dropping as she traced the escape route through narrow canyons and across ridgelines that would hide vehicles from satellite observation. 5 miles east of the ambush site, she found something that made her blood run cold. A makeshift command post, abandoned but still showing signs of recent occupation. Antennas, generator positions, fuel storage, even a cleared area that could have served as a helicopter landing zone. This wasn't a temporary position thrown together for one ambush. This was a forward operating base that had been active for days, maybe weeks. She circled lower, the A-10's gun camera recording everything, when her threat warning system lit up. A radar had found her, was tracking her, and somewhere in those rocks, a missile battery was spinning up. She reacted instantly, releasing flares and chaff, banking hard to break the radar lock, the G-forces pressing her into the seat as the aircraft clawed for altitude. A missile launched, a trail of white smoke rising from a crevice she hadn't even spotted, tracking toward her with single-minded determination. She dove, using the terrain to mask herself, the missile following, its proximity fuse armed and counting down. At the last possible second, she pulled up, shuddering with the strain, and the missile impacted the ridgeline behind her, the explosion close enough that shrapnel pinged off her tail. Her threat warning was screaming now, multiple radars painting her, more missiles preparing to launch. They'd been waiting, had known she'd come back, had set another trap with her as the target. The canyon walls blurred past at 500 knots, the A-10 at the edge of its performance envelope, pushed harder than the designers had ever intended. Vasquez's hands were steady on the stick, her mind racing through options, calculating angles and fuel states and weapons ranges. 2 more missiles launched, their contrails drawing white lines across the sky, converging on her position with geometry that gave her maybe 15 seconds to live. She broke left, then right, a jinking pattern that burned airspeed and altitude but broke the firing solution, the missiles overshooting and detonating against the canyon walls in flowers of fire and shrapnel. Her radar warning receiver showed 3 more SAM sites lighting up, forming a box that was rapidly closing around her. This wasn't an opportunistic ambush. This was an execution, planned and coordinated, waiting for her to come back. They'd known she would, had counted on it, and now she was flying through a kill zone that made the first ambush look gentle. The radio erupted with traffic, tower calling her, demanding her position, Captain Strand's voice cutting through with orders to withdraw, Colonel Thorne's distinctive growl demanding a situation report. But Vasquez ignored it all. Her focus narrowed to the immediate problem of survival and the growing certainty that she'd found something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. She armed her own systems, the GAU-8 cannon coming online with a status indicator that glowed green and ready. If they wanted to kill her, she'd make them pay for every foot. She spotted the command vehicle, the same white Hilux or one just like it, positioned on a ridgeline with a clear line of sight to the entire valley. Someone was directing this, coordinating the SAM sites, turning the canyon into a death trap. She banked hard, diving toward the vehicle, her cannon spooling up with its distinctive sound, when the entire world seemed to explode around her. A missile she hadn't seen, launched from a position she hadn't identified, detonated 20 meters off her right wing. The blast wave hit like a physical blow, throwing the A-10 sideways, alarms screaming as systems failed and warning lights turned the cockpit into a Christmas tree of impending disaster. The right engine was on fire, hydraulics were failing, the flight controls felt mushy and unresponsive. She fought the stick, using pure muscle to force the aircraft level, the canyon walls impossibly close on both sides. Another missile, another explosion, this one behind her, close enough that she felt the heat through the canopy. Muscle memory and training took over, the procedures drilled into her through hundreds of hours of simulator time and real-world emergencies. Fire suppression activated, foam flooding the right engine compartment, choking the flames before they could spread to the fuel lines. She shut down the right engine, watching the instruments wind down to 0, feeling the asymmetric thrust trying to yaw the aircraft into a death spiral. Left rudder full trim, compensating for the imbalance, coaxing the wounded Thunderbolt to fly straight when everything in its design was screaming to roll over and die. The SAM sites were still active, still tracking, but she was low now, terrain masking, using every ridge and valley to break their radar locks. Her fuel state was critical. The right tank had taken damage and was streaming JP-8 in a mist that would ignite if anything sparked. She had maybe 15 minutes of flight time left, maybe less, and she was 60 miles from base over hostile territory. The math was brutal and simple. She couldn't make it back, not with one engine and a fuel leak. She could eject, take her chances on the ground, hope for rescue. But that meant abandoning the aircraft, abandoning the mission, leaving whoever had tried to kill her free to hide their tracks and prepare another ambush. Her hand hovered over the ejection handles, yellow and black striped, promising salvation at the cost of everything else. Then her eyes fell on the camera controls, the feed recording everything, every missile launch, every SAM site, every detail of the command post. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about evidence, about proof that could bring down whoever was orchestrating these attacks. If she ejected, the aircraft would crash, the camera would be destroyed, and everything she'd found would be lost. But if she could make it back, if she could somehow fly a crippled aircraft through 60 miles of hostile airspace on one engine and fumes, she could deliver the proof that would end this. The decision crystallized in her mind with absolute clarity. She was going to make it back, or she was going to die trying, and either way, the camera would keep recording until the end. She adjusted her course, pointing the nose toward home, and keyed the radio. Overwatch, Gravedigger. I'm hit and coming home. Clear the pattern and have fire crews standing by. This is going to be close. Her voice was calm, professional, giving no hint of the calculation she'd just made or the odds stacked against her. The flight back was an exercise in controlled disaster, every mile purchased with skill and determination. The fuel leak was getting worse, the left engine running rough as it tried to compensate for the loss of its twin, and the flight controls were degrading with each passing minute. Vasquez flew with her entire body, using legs, arms, and will to keep the aircraft in something resembling stable flight. She climbed when she could, trading speed for altitude, building a cushion that might save her if the engine quit. She descended when she had to, using gravity to maintain airspeed, the mountains passing beneath her like teeth waiting to bite. The radio chatter had evolved from demands for status to offers of assistance, tankers scrambling to meet her, rescue helicopters spinning up, fighters launching to provide escort. But she was too low, too damaged, flying too close to the edge for any of them to help. This was her fight, her aircraft, her mission to complete. She passed the border at 7:48, the invisible line that separated hostile territory from Allied airspace, and felt no relief because she still had 40 miles to go. The left engine was overheating now, temperature gauges climbing into the red, metal components stressed beyond their design limits. She enriched the mixture, sacrificing fuel economy for cooling, watching her reserves drop toward zero. 10 miles out, the tower started feeding her wind conditions and runway alignment, their voices professional but underscored with tension. 5 miles out, she could see the base, the runway stretching like a promise across the desert floor. 3 miles out, the engine quit. One moment it was running rough but running. The next it wound down with a sound like a sigh, all thrust gone, leaving her in a glide that was sinking faster than she could compensate. She was too low to eject now. The ejection sequence needed altitude to work properly, and the ground was rushing up with terrible speed. She extended the landing gear, felt the aircraft shudder as the wheels locked down, the added drag eating what little airspeed she had left. The runway was ahead, so close she could see the heat shimmer rising from the concrete, but the numbers weren't working. She was sinking too fast, coming in too steep, going to hit short and cartwheel into a fireball. She held the stick with both hands, pulling back, using the last of her momentum to flare, to bleed off speed and stretch the glide. The main gear touched first, a jar that rattled her teeth, the nose still high, the aircraft balancing on the edge of control. Then the nose gear slammed down, the impact brutal, something in the strut giving way with a crack she felt through the airframe. The A-10 veered left off the centerline, heading for the grass and the drainage ditch beyond. Vasquez stood on the right brake, feeling it grab and hold, dragging the aircraft back toward the pavement. The left brake was gone, hydraulics finally failing completely, but she had just enough control to keep it on the runway. The nose gear collapsed now, the aircraft sliding on its belly in a shower of sparks and the terrible sound of metal grinding against concrete. Fire trucks were already moving, foam spraying before the aircraft had even stopped, covering everything in white chemical clouds. The canopy release was manual now, all electrical systems dead, but she cranked the handle and the canopy lifted, fresh air rushing in along with the smell of burning metal and aviation fuel. She climbed out on legs that wanted to shake but wouldn't because she wouldn't let them, dropping to the runway as the fire crews surrounded the aircraft. Chief Torres was there, his face a mask of professional concern covering what looked like either pride or horror, maybe both. "Captain, you need medical evaluation." That was, he trailed off, apparently lacking words for what he'd just witnessed. But Vasquez was already moving, heading for the operations center, her flight suit soaked with sweat, her hands still steady despite everything. "I need to debrief intelligence now. They tried to kill me, which means I found something they can't afford to have found. The gun camera recorded everything. I need it pulled and secured before anyone tries to make it disappear." Colonel Thorne met her at the operations center door, his expression unreadable. "Captain Vasquez, that was the most reckless, insubordinate, and frankly insane piece of flying I've witnessed in 30 years of service. You directly violated orders, flew an unauthorized mission into hostile territory, and nearly got yourself killed." He paused, and something that might have been a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. "It was also the most courageous thing I've ever seen. Get inside. Intelligence is waiting, and apparently, what you found has some people in very high places extremely nervous." The gun camera footage played on multiple screens, analysts crowding around, their expressions growing grimmer with each frame. What Vasquez had found wasn't just an ambush site. It was evidence of a systematic campaign targeting coalition aircraft, coordinated by someone with access to operational intelligence and sophisticated weapon systems. The command post showed signs of Chinese equipment, Russian communications gear, and local militia fighters, a combination that spoke of state sponsorship at the highest levels. Captain Strand froze the image on the white hillocks, enhancing the resolution, pulling details from pixels. "This vehicle appears in satellite imagery from 3 other sites where coalition aircraft have been attacked over the past 6 months. We dismissed it as coincidence, local contractors working the area. But now." She pulled up more images, overlaying them with the gun camera footage. "We're looking at a forward intelligence-gathering operation that's been active for months, feeding real-time information to hostile forces. The question is who's running it and how deep the penetration goes." A new voice spoke from the doorway, cold and carrying authority that made everyone in the room straighten unconsciously. "That would be my concern now, Captain Strand." The man who entered wore civilian clothes but carried himself with military precision, his credentials identifying him as Defense Intelligence Agency, the kind of operative who existed in the shadows between military operations and political reality. He nodded to Vasquez. "Captain, your footage is now classified at a level I can't discuss in this room. What I can tell you is that you've uncovered a foreign intelligence operation that's been targeting our air operations with disturbing success. 5 pilots died in the first ambush, and today they tried to add you to that list. The fact that you survived both and brought back this evidence is either extraordinary luck or extraordinary skill, probably both." He gestured to the screen. "We've identified the individuals running the command post from your footage. 2 are known foreign intelligence operatives. 1 is a local warlord we thought was working with us. This goes deep, Captain, deeper than a tactical operation. You've stumbled into something strategic." Vasquez found her voice pushing past the fatigue and adrenaline crash. "What happens now?" The DIA officer's expression was carved from stone. "Now we move before they can cover their tracks. You've given us actionable intelligence, target locations, proof of foreign involvement. There will be operations, quiet ones, the kind that never make the news. And Captain, you'll need to disappear for a while, protective custody, until we're certain the threat is neutralized." The safe house was 40 miles from the base, a nondescript building that could have been anything from a storage facility to a forgotten admin office. Vasquez spent 3 days there, watched over by professionals who were polite but firm, reading reports that filtered in through channels she normally wouldn't have access to. The operation started within hours of her debrief, cruise missiles striking the command posts she'd identified, Special operations teams hitting locations faster than anyone could have anticipated. Arrests made in 3 countries simultaneously. The network was rolled up with surgical precision, each piece removed before it could warn the others. On the 4th day, Colonel Thorne visited, carrying a folder that looked heavy despite containing only paper. He sat across from her in the small meeting room, his expression weary but satisfied. It's done. The foreign operatives are in custody or dead, the local collaborators are facing trial, and the leak has been plugged. Turns out it was a contractor with access to flight planning systems, working for money rather than ideology. He's been detained, and we're rebuilding our operational security from the ground up. He opened the folder, revealing photographs of the 5 pilots who died in the first ambush. Recommending you for the Silver Star, possibly the Distinguished Flying Cross. What you did both missions falls under the definition of heroism above and beyond. You saved Hammond's life, uncovered a foreign intelligence operation, and brought back evidence that's changing how we conduct air operations across the theater. The entire Air Force is going to know your name, Captain. Vasquez looked at the photographs, faces she'd known, voices she'd heard cut off mid-transmission. I don't want medals, sir. I want those 5 pilots to still be alive. Thorne nodded slowly. So do I, Captain. So do I, but they're not, and nothing we do will change that. What we can do is honor their memory by ensuring their deaths weren't meaningless, by using what happened to make sure it doesn't happen again. You've done that. You've given their sacrifice meaning. He pulled out another document, this one official, bearing multiple signatures and seals. You're being reassigned, Captain. The DIA wants you as an advisor on close air support operations in denied airspace. You'll be flying a desk more than a cockpit, but your tactical insights are valuable enough that they're willing to promote you to major and give you a staff position that carries significant influence. It's not what you signed up for, but it's important work. The ceremony was small, confined to base personnel and the families who could make the journey. 5 empty chairs sat in the front row, placed cards bearing names and call signs, a tradition for the fallen. Behind them, Hammond sat in a wheelchair, his legs still in a cast, his face scarred but healing. He'd insisted on attending despite his doctor's objections, said he owed it to the woman who'd circled his position for 19 minutes, keeping the enemy at bay while he bled into the dirt and waited for rescue. Vasquez stood at attention while Colonel Thorne read the citation, words that tried to capture what had happened in that valley and in the weeks that followed, but words always fell short of the reality. The Silver Star was pinned to her chest, the ribbon bright against her dress blues, a piece of metal that was supposed to represent valor but felt like weight. The Distinguished Flying Cross followed, then a Purple Heart for the wounds she'd sustained, minor compared to what could have been, but regulations required recognition. When it was done, when the last medal was pinned and the last salute rendered, the gathered personnel erupted into applause. Not the polite recognition of military ceremony, but something rawer, more honest, acknowledgement from peers who understood exactly what those medals represented, what she'd endured to earn them. Lieutenant Rourke was there, the pilot who'd once mocked her for being too careful, and when he approached afterward, he couldn't quite meet her eyes. Captain Major Vasquez, I owe you an apology. We all do. The things we said, the way we treated you, it was wrong. We thought you weren't one of us because you didn't fit the mold, didn't play the game, but you were the only one who was actually ready when it mattered. Vasquez looked at him for a long moment, seeing the sincerity beneath the discomfort. You can make it up to me by doing better, Lieutenant, by remembering that there are different kinds of strength, different kinds of courage, and by making sure the next pilot who doesn't fit your mold gets the respect they deserve from day one, not after they've proven themselves in blood. She turned away, walking toward where Hammond waited, using his good leg to stand, wavering but upright. He saluted, crisp despite the pain it obviously caused, and she returned it. Thank you doesn't cover it, he said quietly. You saved my life, stayed when you should have run. I heard the radio traffic afterward, know how close it was. The reassignment took effect 2 weeks later. A desk in the Pentagon with a window that looked out over the Potomac and parking lots full of cars that would never smell like jet fuel. Major Myra Vasquez, call sign Gravedigger, advisor to the Joint Staff on Close Air Support Operations in High-Threat Environments. The title was impressive. The work was important, but part of her would always be in that cockpit, hands on the stick, the smell of burned metal and hydraulic fluid, the roar of engines that turned jet fuel into violence and protection. She attended meetings now, briefings with generals and colonels, discussions of policy and doctrine that would shape how the Air Force conducted operations for years to come. Her insights, paid for in blood and terror, were transforming how they thought about air support in denied airspace. The lessons from those two missions were being written into training manuals, taught at weapons schools, becoming the baseline for a new generation of pilots. But at night, alone in her apartment in Arlington, she'd wake from dreams where she was flying again, circling a position where someone was dying, counting ammunition that would never be enough, making decisions that would haunt her regardless of the outcome. The therapist the Air Force assigned her said it was normal, expected, that trauma took time to process. But Vasquez knew it wasn't about time. It was about carrying the weight of those who didn't come home, about being the one who survived when others didn't, about the fundamental unfairness of chance and circumstance that decided who flew into the ambush first and who flew rear security. 6 months after the mission, she received a letter forwarded through official channels, the envelope worn and travel-stained. Inside was a single page, handwritten in careful script. Major Vasquez, you don't know me, but I'm Rachel Chen, Boomer's sister, the one who wanted to be a pilot. My brother talked about you in his last letter home, said you were the best stick he'd seen, that you flew like you understood the aircraft was alive. He also said the squadron didn't respect you enough, that they couldn't see past their own prejudices to recognize talent. He was planning to recommend you for mission commander once you got more combat time. I'm writing because I want you to know that his faith wasn't misplaced. What you did, staying to protect Lieutenant Hammond, uncovering the operation that got my brother killed, it means something. She continued reading, Rachel's words blurring slightly as tears formed despite her best efforts to remain composed. I started flight school 3 months ago. Every day is hard. Every day I doubt whether I belong here. But then I think about you, about what you did with a damaged aircraft and no support, about how you refused to quit when quitting was the only logical choice. You're the reason I keep going. You're proof that we belong in the cockpit, that we can do this job as well as anyone. Better sometimes. I don't know if I'll ever meet you, if our paths will cross in this massive Air Force we've both chosen to serve. But I wanted you to know that you're not alone, that there are others of us following the trail you've blazed. When I get my wings, when I earn my own call sign, I'll carry a piece of what you've shown is possible. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for showing us what's possible when someone refuses to accept what everyone else thinks are the limits. Clear skies and fair winds, Rachel Chen. Vasquez folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer where she kept the few personal items that mattered, photographs of her squadron, the flight manual from her first aircraft, a challenge coin from Chief Tours with 5 stars etched around its rim. She sat at her desk, looking out at the ordinary traffic, the ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware of the extraordinary measures taken to protect those ordinary moments. Her phone buzzed with a reminder about tomorrow's meeting, a briefing on proposed changes to close air support doctrine. She'd be presenting findings from her missions, recommendations that would affect how pilots trained, how commanders planned, how the Air Force thought about operations in contested airspace. It was important work, necessary work, but part of her would always be in that valley, making the split-second decisions that separated the living from the dead. Later that evening, she drove to Arlington National Cemetery, walking the precise rows until she found the section where Air Force personnel were laid to rest. 4 graves, 4 names, Falcon and Reaper and Boomer and Skid, their stones marking the end of stories that should have had so many more chapters. She stood at attention, rendered a salute that no one was there to return, and spoke quietly into the dusk. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry you died because someone valued money over honor, information over lives. But I want you to know it mattered. Your sacrifice wasn't wasted." 18 months later, Major Vasquez found herself back at the base where it had all happened, this time as an instructor for a new program on survival in high-threat environments. The Air Force had decided that her experience was too valuable to remain in one staff position, that pilots needed to hear directly from someone who'd lived through what they might face. The ready room was packed, 24 pilots ranging from lieutenants fresh from training to majors with deployment patches covering their flight suits, all there to learn from the woman who'd become something of a legend. The story had spread, evolved, been polished by repetition, until it gleamed with mythic overtones. She spent the first 10 minutes of her presentation stripping away the myth, bringing it back to the brutal reality of what actually happened, the fear, the uncertainty, the moments of pure terror when she didn't know if her decisions were right or catastrophically wrong. She showed them the gun camera footage, unedited, including the parts where her voice cracked over the radio, where she nearly lost control of the aircraft, where luck played as much a role as skill. "I'm not here to be inspirational," she said, her voice cutting through the respectful silence. "I'm here to prepare you for the worst day of your career, for the moment when everything goes wrong and you have to make decisions with incomplete information and no good options. Some of you will face that moment. Statistically, it's inevitable. And when it happens, I want you to remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite the fear. That heroism isn't about being superhuman. It's about being thoroughly, exhaustingly human while refusing to quit." She talked about mission planning, about the importance of questioning intelligence assessments, about the need for backup plans and contingencies. She discussed fuel management, ammunition conservation, threat assessment under stress. But mostly she talked about the mental preparation, the necessity of making peace with mortality before climbing into the cockpit, so that fear didn't paralyze when action was required. During the break, a young lieutenant approached, her name tag reading Chen, R. and Vasquez felt time fold in on itself. Rachel Chen, Boomer's sister, now wearing silver wings and the confident bearing of someone who'd earned their place. "Major Vasquez, I wanted to introduce myself. I wrote you a letter once, don't know if you remember." Vasquez smiled, the expression feeling strange but genuine. "I remember. You said you were going to earn your wings, carry a piece of what I'd shown was possible. Looks like you did." Rachel nodded, her expression serious. "I graduate from the B course next month, headed to an A-10 squadron. They're calling me Ember, said it's because I burn slow but never go out. I wanted to ask." She hesitated, vulnerability showing through the professional composure. "How do you carry it? The weight of those who didn't make it, the responsibility of being one who survived." Vasquez was quiet for a moment, considering the question that had no easy answer. "You carry it by honoring their memory through your actions, by being the pilot they would have wanted watching their six, by making the Air Force better than it was, so their sacrifice means something. And some days, you carry it by simply putting one foot in front of the other, by getting up and doing the job even when it feels impossible." She paused, looking at the young pilot who carried her dead squadron mate's eyes and determination. "Your brother was a good pilot and a better man. He believed in you, believed you had what it takes. Don't prove him wrong." Rachel straightened, coming to attention without quite realizing it. "I won't, ma'am. I promise." The afternoon session covered tactical decision-making, using the ambush mission as a case study. Vasquez walked them through each decision point, explaining her reasoning, acknowledging the places where luck played a role, highlighting the moments where training and preparation made the difference between survival and catastrophe. She showed them how she'd analyzed the terrain, identified escape routes, prioritized targets based on threat assessment. But she also showed them the mistakes, the moments where she'd nearly chosen wrong, where instinct had overridden doctrine and saved her life. "The textbook will get you killed," she said bluntly, "if you follow it blindly in a situation where the textbook doesn't apply. You need to know the doctrine so well that you understand when to break it, when the situation demands innovation rather than procedure. But you also need the judgment to know when your instinct is right and when it's panic talking. That line is thin, and sometimes you won't know which side you were on until it's over. A captain in the back raised his hand. "Ma'am, at what point did you decide to stay and fight rather than withdraw? The doctrine says to break contact when faced with overwhelming force." Vasquez met his eyes. "The doctrine assumes you're alone, that no one else is depending on you. But Lieutenant Hammond was on the ground and leaving him meant he'd die." She continued, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room focus completely. "I made the decision to stay knowing I might not make it back, accepting that the aircraft could be destroyed, that I could be killed or captured. But I also knew that if I left, if I followed the textbook and withdrew, Hammond would definitely die. The math was brutal but simple, possible death versus certain death. I chose possible." The room was silent, the weight of that choice hanging in the air. Another pilot, a major with combat experience visible in his weathered face and careful eyes, spoke up. "How do you prepare for that moment? For the decision where there's no right answer, just degrees of wrong?" Vasquez appreciated the question, its honesty cutting through the usual bravado. "You prepare by understanding your values before the crisis hits. You decide in advance what you're willing to die for. For me, it was clear. I took an oath to support and defend, and implicit in that oath is the promise to bring everyone home or die trying. When the moment came, I didn't have to deliberate. I already knew what I was going to do." She advanced the presentation, showing post-mission analysis, lessons learned, changes implemented across the force because of what happened in that valley. 5 pilots died that day because someone betrayed operational security and because our intelligence failed to identify the threat. Those are systemic failures, the kind that no amount of individual skill can overcome. But what we can control is our response, our preparation, our refusal to let those deaths be meaningless. Every change we've made to how we plan missions, how we assess intelligence, how we train for operations in denied airspace, those changes are written in blood, purchased with the lives of Falcon and Reaper and Boomer and Skid and Hammer's months of recovery. The session ended with a Q&A that ran long, pilots asking detailed tactical questions, seeking the kind of ground truth that only someone who'd lived it could provide. Vasquez answered each with careful honesty, refusing to sugarcoat the difficulty or diminish the terror, but also refusing to make it seem impossible. When the last pilot filed out, Rachel lingered, clearly wanting to say something more. "My brother was right about you," she finally said. "He could see what others missed. I wish he was here to see what you've become, what you're teaching us." The years accumulated like flight hours, each one adding experience and perspective, but also distance from the cockpit. Major Vasquez became Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez, then Colonel, her career trajectory steep and unorthodox for someone who'd started as the pilot no one expected to amount to much. She commanded a training squadron, then a wing, bringing to each position the hard-earned wisdom of someone who understood that procedures existed to save lives, but sometimes had to be broken for the same reason. Her reputation preceded her, the commander who'd stayed when others would have run, who'd survived what should have been unsurvivable, who transformed tragedy into institutional change. But she never let the reputation become a shield, never used her past to avoid the hard decisions of the present. She made enemies among those who preferred the old ways, who saw her insistence on questioning intelligence and empowering junior officers as threats to good order and discipline. She made allies among those who understood that excellence came in many forms, that diversity of thought and experience made units stronger rather than weaker. 10 years after the mission that defined her career, she found herself at the Air Force Academy, addressing cadets who'd been in middle school when she'd circled Hammond's position counting ammunition. They looked impossibly young, their uniforms crisp and their eyes bright with the kind of idealism that hadn't yet been tested by reality. She didn't want to crush that idealism, but she needed to temper it with truth. "You're here because you want to serve, because you believe in something larger than yourselves," she began, standing without notes, without the protective barrier of a podium. That's admirable, necessary, the foundation of everything we do. But service is hard in ways you can't imagine yet, and believing in something isn't enough. You need skills, judgment, the ability to function when you're terrified and everything's going wrong. You need to know yourselves well enough to understand when you're thinking clearly and when fear is making decisions for you. She told them the story, not the polished version that appeared in training manuals, but the messy reality, the jokes at her expense, the exclusion from the brotherhood, the mission she shouldn't have survived. She told them about the 5 empty chairs, about Hammond's blood soaking into Afghan soil, about the 19 minutes that felt like 19 hours. And she told them about the choice, the calculation she'd made in a fraction of a second, the decision to stay that defined everything that came after. One cadet, confident in the way only those who have never been tested can be, raised her hand during the Q&A. Colonel, if you could go back knowing what you know now, would you make the same decision? To stay instead of withdrawing? Vasquez considered the question, giving it the weight it deserved. I'd like to think I would. The outcome was good. Hammond survived. We uncovered the intelligence operation. Changes were made. But outcomes are partially luck, and I was lucky in ways that weren't skill. If the engine had failed 5 minutes earlier, if one more missile had gotten through, if any of 100 variables had been slightly different, I'd be one more name on a memorial wall. So the real question isn't whether I'd make the same choice, it's whether I'd want you to make it. She let the silence stretch. Every cadet in the auditorium focused completely. And the answer is, I don't know. I can teach you tactics and judgment and how to push past fear. But I can't tell you what's worth dying for because that's personal, individual, the kind of decision only you can make. What I can tell you is that if you're not willing to examine that question now, before the crisis, you'll make that decision under the worst possible circumstances, and you might not like the person you discover you are. After the address, walking across the academy grounds with mountains rising in the distance and the chapel spires catching the afternoon sun, she encountered a memorial that hadn't existed the last time she'd visited. 5 names, carved in granite, with a plaque explaining their sacrifice. Falcon and Reaper and Boomer and Skid, forever young, forever memorialized in stone that would outlast the memory of anyone who knew them. She stood there long after her escort had discreetly withdrawn, giving her privacy with the dead. 20 years now, she said quietly to the names. 20 years since that morning. The world's moved on, the war we were fighting is history now, and there are cadets in that auditorium who weren't alive when you died. But I haven't forgotten. I've tried to honor what you represent, tried to make your sacrifice mean something beyond the mission reports and classified briefings. She traced Boomer's name with her finger, remembering his laugh and his little sister's determination. Rachel made colonel last year, commands a fighter wing now. She's everything you hoped she'd be. The sun was setting when she finally left the memorial, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple that reminded her of dawns in Afghanistan, of the sky framed by a canopy already spiderwebbed with cracks. Her driver was waiting patiently, a young airman who probably didn't know the significance of the memorial or the woman he was driving, and that was fine. Better, even, to be just another colonel moving between obligations rather than the subject of stories that grew with each telling. Her final assignment before retirement was what the Air Force called a prestige position, Deputy Commander of Air Combat Command, responsible for the training and readiness of thousands of pilots across hundreds of squadrons. The job was administrative, meetings and budgets and policy decisions, the kind of work that kept the enterprise running but felt distant from the cockpit. Yet she found satisfaction in it, in knowing that the programs she advocated for, the training standards she insisted on, the cultural changes she pushed through resistance and bureaucracy, all of it made pilots safer, better prepared, more likely to come home. She saw echoes of her younger self in the young officers who passed through her office, the ones who didn't fit the traditional mold, who were underestimated and overlooked. She made it her mission to identify them, mentor them, ensure they received opportunities based on merit rather than perception. Some flourished, some washed out, but all knew that someone with stars on her shoulders understood what it meant to be the one who didn't belong, who had to prove themselves over and over while others got the benefit of the doubt. On her last day of active service, before the retirement ceremony with its speeches and honors and inevitable emotional weight, she made one final trip in an A-10. Not as pilot in command. Regulations and insurance made that impossible for someone who hadn't maintained flight currency. But in the rear seat of a two-seat trainer variant, with a young captain handling the controls. They flew over the desert, the landscape both familiar and strange after so many years away, and for a few hours she was simply a pilot again, feeling the vibration of the engines, the response of the aircraft to the stick, the unique sensation of being aloft in a machine designed for one purpose, to bring people home, whatever the cost. The captain flying was competent and confident, calling out checkpoints and executing maneuvers with the ease of someone for whom flight was second nature. During a tactical turn, she asked the question Vasquez had been expecting. "Ma'am, permission to ask about the mission, the one everyone talks about." Vasquez smiled, though the captain couldn't see it from the front seat. "Permission granted, though I'm not sure what's left to tell. It's been analyzed and dissected in every classroom and symposium for 2 decades. Not about the tactics, ma'am, about what it felt like after, when you realized you'd survived and they hadn't, how you carried that forward without it destroying you." The question was more insightful than most, cutting past the technical to the human. Vasquez was quiet for a moment, watching the desert scroll beneath them, unchanging and patient. "I don't know that I did carry it without it changing me. I think experiences like that either destroy you or transform you, and which one happens is partially choice and partially grace. I chose to honor them by being better, by making the service better. But there were nights I didn't sleep, days I questioned every decision, moments where the weight felt impossible." She paused, searching for words adequate to the truth. "But I also learned that survival creates an obligation. Not guilt, though there was plenty of that, but responsibility. I survived to tell the story, to teach the lessons, to ensure their deaths meant something. That obligation gave me purpose when grief would have been easier. It forced me to look forward instead of backward, to build instead of mourn." The captain executed a perfect combat descent, the dropping like a stone before leveling out at low altitude, terrain features sharp and immediate. "Thank you, ma'am. That means something, hearing it from you." They flew for another hour, running simulated attack profiles and defensive maneuvers, the kind of practice that kept skills sharp and judgment sound. When they finally turned back toward base, the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that reminded Vasquez of every mission she'd ever flown, every dawn she'd watched from a cockpit, every sunset that marked another day survived. The landing was smooth, the captain clearly wanting to impress, and as they taxied back to the ramp, Vasquez could see a crowd gathering. The retirement ceremony wouldn't be delayed any longer. The ceremony was everything military retirements were supposed to be. Formal and heartfelt, speeches that balanced accomplishment with humor, the traditional rituals that marked the transition from active service to veteran status. The commanding general spoke about her career with the kind of praise that made her uncomfortable, highlighting not just the mission everyone knew about but the decades of service that followed. The pilots trained, the policies changed, the culture shifted incrementally toward something better. Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Chen was there in dress blues, seated in the front row next to Chief Torres, who'd retired years ago but made the trip specifically for this. When it came time for Vasquez's remarks, she stood at the podium looking out at faces young and old, some she knew and many she didn't, all part of the institution she'd served for 33 years. "I joined the Air Force because I loved flying and wanted to serve something larger than myself," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I stayed because I discovered that service isn't just about what you do, it's about who you become in the doing. The people I've served with, the missions we've accomplished, the tragedies we've endured, all of it shaped me into someone I hope is worthy of the uniform." She spoke about the 5 names that still haunted her, about Hammond's recovery and retirement, about the countless pilots she'd trained and mentored. But mostly, she spoke about the responsibility they all shared, to each other, to the mission, to the people who depended on them to stand between peace and chaos. In a few minutes, they'll call for my last salute and I'll walk away from active service. But the obligation doesn't end, the commitment doesn't expire. I'll still be accountable to those 5 names on the memorial, to every pilot I've trained, to the institution that gave me purpose and identity. Retirement changes the uniform, not the duty. The final salute was rendered by Rachel Chen, a symmetry that felt appropriate. The sister of a man who died carrying forward the tradition of service, saluting the woman who tried to save him. The moment stretched, heavy with meaning and memory, before Vasquez returned the salute and the official portion of her career ended. But afterward, in the informal gathering where speeches gave way to stories and coffee gave way to something stronger, the truth became clear. She wasn't leaving, not really. She'd be consulting, teaching, writing the kind of institutional memory that transformed experience into wisdom. The Air Force didn't let people like Colonel Mayra Vasquez simply fade away. They'd already approached her about positions on advisory boards, about teaching positions at the War College, about contributing to the next generation of doctrine. She'd accepted some and declined others, carving out a role that let her contribute without being consumed. 6 months into retirement, she published a book that surprised everyone, including herself. Not a memoir of the mission. That story had been told too many times already, but a broader examination of leadership under crisis, drawing from her experiences but focusing on the principles rather than the specifics. It became required reading at the academy and in command courses, not because it offered easy answers, but because it asked difficult questions and trusted readers to find their own truth. The book tour brought her to universities and military bases, bookstores and conference centers, each venue filled with people who wanted to understand how ordinary humans performed extraordinary actions when circumstances demanded it. She spoke about fear and courage, about the difference between recklessness and calculated risk, about the moral weight of command decisions. And she spoke about the afterward, about living with choices made in extremis, about honoring the dead by serving the living. At one such event at a small college in Ohio, a student asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. "Do you think you're a hero?" Vasquez considered the word, its weight and implications, the way it simplified complexity and elevated the human to something more than human. "I think I did my job under difficult circumstances." The word hero suggests something exceptional, but what I did was execute training, follow instinct, and refuse to quit when quitting was the easy choice. That's not superhuman, it's thoroughly human. It's what we're all capable of when tested. So no, I'm not comfortable with hero. I'm comfortable with pilot, with officer, with servant. Those are roles I chose and worked to fulfill. The rest is narrative we construct to make sense of chaos. But the audience didn't want complexity. They wanted inspiration, wanted to believe that ordinary people could become extraordinary. And maybe, Vasquez thought, that was okay. Maybe the myth served a purpose even if it diverged from messy reality. The final chapter of her story, though she didn't know it would be final when it began, came 15 years into her retirement. She was 71, still sharp but feeling the weight of years in joints that ached in the morning, and a body that no longer responded to her will with the immediacy it once had. She'd slowed down, teaching less frequently, spending more time in the small house she'd bought in the mountains where the sky reminded her of flying without the need to actually leave the ground. Then came the call from Rachel Chen, now a brigadier general and on track for stars that would take her to the highest levels of command. "Colonel, I need your help. We're redesigning the survival training curriculum, incorporating lessons from recent conflicts and changing threat environments. I want you to lead the working group. Bring your experience to bear on preparing the next generation for what they might face." Vasquez's first instinct was to decline. She'd done her time, contributed her share, earned the right to fade into quiet retirement. But she thought about 5 names on a memorial, about a young lieutenant she'd circled while counting ammunition, about the obligation that survived the uniform. Send me the details. I'll make it work. The working group met quarterly, a mix of active-duty pilots, academic experts, and retired personnel like herself. They analyzed recent operations, identifying patterns and lessons, translating experience into teachable principles. Vasquez found herself energized by the work, by the discussions that challenged assumptions and pushed past comfortable orthodoxy. She advocated for realistic training that prepared pilots for the psychological stress of combat, not just the technical challenges. She pushed for programs that taught decision-making under uncertainty, that acknowledged fear as a factor to manage rather than a weakness to suppress. And she insisted on incorporating failure into training, controlled failure that taught lessons without costing lives, that built resilience and judgment. The curriculum they developed was adopted force-wide, changing how pilots trained and thought about operations in high-threat environments. It was her final contribution, the last piece of a legacy built over decades, and it felt appropriate, beginning and ending with preparing others to face what she'd faced, equipping them to survive and succeed where she'd barely survived at all. She attended one last ceremony at the academy, the dedication of an expanded memorial that now included names from subsequent conflicts, a growing list of those who'd paid the final price in service. Standing before the memorial on a spring morning with cadets arrayed in formation and generals offering remarks about sacrifice and duty, Vasquez felt the weight of all those years, the fear and determination of that mission, the decades of service that followed, the slow transformation from pilot to legend to something more complicated than either. When they called her forward to speak, she declined the microphone, choosing instead to address them directly, her voice still strong despite the years. I'm here today representing a generation that's passing, making way for yours. We've tried to leave you better prepared than we were, tried to learn from our mistakes so you don't have to repeat them. But some lessons can only be learned through experience, through facing the moment when everything depends on your decision, and there's no time to consult doctrine or seek advice. She gestured to the memorial, the names carved in stone. These people represent the cost of service, the price we pay for the mission and the values we defend. But they also represent something more, the obligation we bear to each other. Every name here had squadron mates who survived, who carry their memory forward, who try to honor their sacrifice by being worthy of it. That's the real burden of survival, living in a way that justifies why you're here and they're not. The cadets were silent, absorbing words that would only make full sense years from now, when they'd lost their own people and faced their own impossible choices. Vasquez could see younger versions of herself in their faces, the eager ones who thought they knew what courage was, the uncertain ones who doubted they had what it took, the outliers who didn't fit the standard mold. She hoped the service had become more welcoming since her time, more willing to recognize that excellence came in many forms, but she suspected the struggle remained. After the ceremony, as the formation dispersed and the memorial returned to quiet dignity, Rachel Chen approached with a younger officer in tow, a lieutenant with pilot wings and an expression Vasquez recognized as carefully controlled nervousness. "Colonel Vasquez, this is Lieutenant Sofia Ibarra. She's headed to A-10 training next month. I thought you two should meet." The lieutenant saluted, crisp and precise, and Vasquez returned it before extending her hand. "Lieutenant, what's your story?" Sophia hesitated, the kind of pause that suggested she was deciding how honest to be. "Ma'am, I'm first-generation college, first in my family to serve. I've wanted to fly since I was a kid, but the path hasn't been easy. I've been told I'm too small, too young, too different from what a fighter pilot should be. But I've also been told that you're proof those voices are wrong, that the measure of a pilot isn't whether they fit the stereotype, but whether they have the skill and judgment to do the job." Vasquez saw herself 3 decades ago, heard echoes of the doubts and determination that had driven her through a career that began with mockery and ended with respect. "Lieutenant, the voices that tell you you're not enough will never fully go away. They'll just evolve, find new reasons to doubt you even as you prove them wrong over and over. The question isn't whether you can silence those voices. You can't." The question is whether you can fly anyway, whether you can execute the mission knowing some people will never give you the credit you've earned. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. But here's what I learned. You're not flying for them. You're flying for the people who depend on you, for the squadron mates whose lives might depend on your skill, for the mission that matters regardless of who gets recognized. If you can accept that, if you can find satisfaction in the work itself rather than the recognition, you'll be fine. More than fine, you'll be the kind of pilot who makes everyone around them better. Sophia nodded, something like relief flickering across her face. Thank you, ma'am, that helps. As the lieutenant walked away, Rachel spoke quietly. You gave her something I couldn't, the perspective of someone who walked that path and came out the other side intact. She needed to hear it from you. Vasquez watched the young officer disappear into the crowd of cadets and instructors, another generation preparing for their own trials. We're all just carrying forward what we were given, passing the lessons down the line. That's how institutions survive, through the accumulated wisdom of those who came before, filtered through the experience of those who come after. They stood together in comfortable silence, two women who'd chosen service and found it both harder and more rewarding than they'd imagined, looking at a memorial that would outlast them both, bearing witness to the price and promise of the uniform. Years collapsed into moments, the way memory works when the end approaches. Vasquez watched from her porch as aircraft traced contrails across the sky, each one carrying someone's daughter or son toward futures unknown. She'd stopped counting the years since that mission. Time had lost its sharp edges, becoming more fluid, more forgiving. She thought about the five less often now, but when she did, it was with gratitude rather than grief. Gratitude that she'd known them, that their brief lives had intersected with hers, that their deaths had purpose and meaning because people like Rachel and Sophia were flying better prepared missions in safer aircraft with doctrine written in the blood of earlier generations. She thought about Hammond occasionally, wondered if he still woke with phantom pains from injuries decades healed, if he thought about those 19 minutes when he'd lain bleeding while an A-10 circled overhead, buying him time measured in ammunition expenditure and the will of one pilot who refused to leave. She'd received a letter from him years ago, simple and direct. You saved my life. I've tried to live worthy of that gift. Thank you. She'd written back, equally simple. You gave me purpose when I needed it most. We saved each other. The book she'd written had found new life in a second edition, updated with lessons from recent conflicts but retaining the core argument. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That leadership in crisis required both competence and character. That the military's greatest strength was its people and their willingness to sacrifice for something larger than themselves. Students still wrote her letters, asking questions about specific decisions, seeking advice for their own careers, thanking her for showing what was possible when someone refused to accept what everyone else considered inevitable. She answered when she could, though her energy was limited now, rationed like ammunition in that long-ago valley, each expenditure calculated to achieve maximum effect. On a morning in late autumn, with leaves turning gold and the air carrying the crispness that presaged winter, she received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 40s, wearing civilian clothes but moving with military bearing, carrying a folder that looked official. Colonel Vasquez, I'm Dr. Emily Torres. I'm writing the official history of women in combat aviation, and your story is central to the narrative. I was hoping you'd consent to an interview. Vasquez invited her in, made coffee more out of habit than hospitality, and settled into the conversation with the wariness of someone who'd told the story too many times and watched it transform with each telling. But Dr. Torres was different. Her questions were precise, focused not on the dramatic moments but on the context and aftermath, on what it meant to be a woman in a male-dominated field, to be underestimated and excluded, to prove yourself in the most extreme circumstances possible. The narrative around your career has become simplified over time, Torres said, reviewing her notes. You're remembered for the mission, for the Silver Star and the Distinguished Flying Cross. But I'm interested in what came before and after, the systemic barriers you faced, the cultural resistance, the years of competent service that were dismissed because you didn't fit the image of what a fighter pilot should be. How do you contextualize the mission within that broader experience? Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, organizing thoughts she'd carried for decades but rarely articulated. The mission was important, but it wasn't the point. The point was that I had to prove myself in the most extreme way possible before anyone would acknowledge what should have been obvious from my performance record, that I was a competent pilot who deserved respect and opportunity. And even after the mission, there were people who attributed my survival to luck rather than skill, who found ways to diminish what I'd accomplished because acknowledging it would require them to examine their own prejudices. She paused, sipping coffee that had gone cold. But the harder truth is that the system was changing, slowly, reluctantly, pushed by people like me who refused to quit and by leaders who recognized that excellence came in many forms. By the time I retired, the Air Force was better, not perfect, but better. Women were flying combat missions, commanding squadrons, making general. The barriers still existed, but they were lower, more permeable. That's the real legacy, not one mission but decades of incremental progress. Dr. Torres made notes, nodding. You've mentored dozens of female pilots over your career. What did you tell them about navigating a system that wasn't designed for them? I told them the truth, that it would be harder, that they'd have to be better to be considered equal, that they'd face resistance and doubt and the thousand small cuts of systemic bias. She continued, her voice carrying the weight of experience transformed into wisdom. But I also told them that they weren't alone, that every generation made it easier for the next, that their success would pave the way for others. And I told them to find satisfaction in the work itself, because external validation might never come or might come too late. The mission matters, the people matter, the service matters. The recognition is secondary. Torres leaned forward, her expression intent. In your book, you write about the obligation of survival, this sense that surviving when others died created a responsibility to honor their memory through your actions. Can you expand on that? How did that obligation shape your career? Vasquez looked out the window, seeing not the mountains but a valley in Afghanistan, smoke trails against a morning sky, 5 aircraft that would never come home. When you survive something that killed others, especially when the line between who lived and who died was luck and positioning rather than merit, you're left with a question: why me? Why did I survive when they didn't? The easy answer is pure chance. I was flying rear security because I was underestimated, and that positioning saved my life. But accepting that answer, accepting that it was just luck, felt like diminishing their deaths, like saying nothing mattered. She turned back to Torres, her eyes clear and direct. So I chose to believe it mattered, that my survival created an obligation to make their deaths meaningful. I did that by improving the service, by training better pilots, by ensuring the lessons learned were written into doctrine so future missions would be safer. Every pilot I mentored, every policy I influenced, every time I pushed back against prejudice or incompetence, that was honoring their memory, giving their sacrifice purpose. Torres was silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of that commitment. And now, in retirement with decades between you and that mission, does the obligation persist? It does, Vasquez said simply. It will until I die. That's the price of survival, and I've never begrudged paying it. Those 5 gave everything. The least I can do is give what I can for as long as I can. The interview continued through the afternoon, ranging across decades of service, touching on missions and policies, challenges and triumphs, the slow arc of a career that had changed not just one woman's trajectory, but the institution itself. When Dr. Torres finally departed, promising to send drafts for review, Vasquez sat in the quiet of her house feeling both exhausted and satisfied. She told the story again, but this time it felt different. Less about the mission, more about the meaning, less about individual heroism, and more about collective progress. That night she dreamed of flying, not the violent combat missions that sometimes still haunted her sleep, but the simple joy of being aloft, of seeing the world from above, of understanding in a visceral way the freedom and perspective that came from escaping gravity's hold. She woke feeling peaceful, a rare sensation that she savored like good coffee or the first warmth of spring sun. 3 months later, Dr. Torres' book was published, a comprehensive history that contextualized Vasquez's career within the broader struggle for women's equality in military aviation. The reviews were positive, academics praising its rigor, while veterans appreciated its honesty about the challenges and progress. Vasquez received a copy with a handwritten note. "Thank you for trusting me with your story. I hope I've done justice to both the mission and the meaning." She read it slowly, finding herself in the pages but also finding something larger, a narrative of institutional change, of barriers erected and slowly dismantled, of individuals whose courage wasn't just physical but moral, who fought not just against external enemies but against internal prejudice. The book dedicated its final chapter to the next generation, to pilots like Sofia Ibarra, who would fly missions and face challenges their predecessors could only imagine, who would benefit from the progress purchased by those who came before. It ended with a quote from Vasquez, taken from one of her teaching sessions. "The measure of your service isn't the medals you earn or the recognition you receive. It's whether the institution you leave behind is better than the one you joined, whether the people who come after you have an easier path because you walked it first." That's the real heroism, not the dramatic moments in crisis, but the daily choice to serve something larger than yourself, to make incremental progress toward a more perfect service, to pass forward the wisdom purchased through your experience. On a spring morning 5 years after that interview, with dawn breaking over mountains that had witnessed countless sunrises before and would witness countless more after, Colonel Myra Vasquez, call sign Gravedigger, passed quietly in her sleep. She was 79, had lived a full life measured by any standard, and left behind a legacy that extended far beyond one mission in one valley on one morning decades past. The memorial service was held at the Air Force Academy, in the chapel she'd always found beautiful, with its soaring architecture reaching toward the sky she'd loved. The chapel was full, generals and privates, active duty and retired, pilots she'd mentored and commanders she'd challenged. Rachel Chen delivered the eulogy, her voice steady but her eyes bright with emotion, speaking about a woman who'd shown generations what was possible when courage met competence, when character was forged in crisis, and then sustained through decades of quieter service. She didn't want to be remembered as a hero, Rachel said, her words carrying to every corner of the crowded chapel. She wanted to be remembered as a pilot, as a teacher, as someone who served. But what she was, what she'll always be, is proof that the measure of a person isn't whether they fit someone else's definition of what they should be. It's whether they have the strength to define themselves, to refuse the limitations others try to impose, to fly their own course regardless of the headwinds they face. After the service, as the mourners dispersed and the chapel returned to its patient waiting, a small group made their way to the memorial where 5 names had been joined by so many others. They stood in silence, Rachel Chen and Sofia Ibarra, now a captain with combat experience of her own, Chief Torres who'd outlived the colonel by sheer stubbornness and good genes, Lieutenant Hammond who'd flown in despite his age and the difficulty of travel, and a dozen others whose lives had been shaped by brief contact with a woman who'd refused to accept what everyone else considered inevitable. Someone had placed a small model A-10 at the base of the memorial, and Hammond bent stiffly to add something beside it, his Purple Heart, the one earned when Vasquez had circled his position for 19 minutes. "She saved my life," he said quietly to no one in particular. "But more than that, she showed me what service actually means. Not the speeches and ceremonies, but the decision to stay when leaving would be easier." Sophia touched one of the names, Boomer, Rachel's brother, the uncle she'd never met but whose story had inspired her own choice to serve. "I never knew him," she said, "but I know her, and through her, I know what he represented. The brotherhood that isn't about gender, the commitment that transcends self-interest, the willingness to sacrifice for something larger." They stood together as the sun climbed higher, warming the stone and the living equally, the present honoring the past while preparing for the future. Eventually, they dispersed, returning to duties and lives that would continue the work Vasquez had begun, making the service better, preparing the next generation, honoring the fallen by serving the living. That evening, Rachel sat in her office reviewing the training curriculum Vasquez had helped develop, now in its third revision but still bearing the stamp of the woman who'd refused to let tragedy be meaningless. She thought about the colonel's words, spoken years ago during one of their last conversations. The story doesn't end with me, it continues through you and everyone we've trained. That's how institutions survive, through transmission, through carrying forward the lessons and values and commitments that define us at our best. Rachel pulled out a piece of paper and began drafting a message that would go to every pilot in her command, every officer under her authority. It read simply, "Today we lost a pioneer, a teacher, and a warrior who showed generations what was possible when courage met competence. Colonel Myra Vasquez, call sign Gravedigger, served for 33 years and spent another 25 teaching those of us who followed. She asked not to be remembered as a hero, but as a pilot who did her duty. We honor her by doing ours, by being the pilots and officers and leaders she trained us to be, by making the service better with each decision we make, by refusing to accept limitations that aren't real. Fair winds and following seas, Colonel. We have the watch." She sent the message and sat back, feeling the weight and privilege of command, understanding in a way she hadn't before that leadership was ultimately about stewardship, receiving wisdom from those who came before, refining it through your own experience, and passing it forward to those who would follow. The decades passed as they always do, the immediate fading into memory, memory fading into history, history becoming the foundation upon which the future is built. Colonel Vasquez's name was added to the memorial she'd stood before so many times, one more among thousands, her story one thread in the vast tapestry of service and sacrifice. But her influence persisted in ways both tangible and subtle, in the training programs that bore her fingerprints, in the doctrine that reflected her hard-won lessons, in the culture that had slowly, painfully, evolved to be more inclusive and more honest about what excellence actually looked like. 50 years after that mission in the Afghan Valley, a young pilot named Elena Rodriguez sat in a briefing room at Creech Air Force Base, preparing for a combat mission that would be conducted not from a cockpit but from a console, flying a drone over terrain half a world away. The technology had changed, the tactics had evolved, but the fundamental challenges remained. How to make life-and-death decisions with imperfect information. How to honor the responsibility of holding others' lives in your hands. How to carry the weight of what you've done and who you couldn't save. Her instructor, Major James Chen, Rachel's grandson, carrying forward a family tradition of service, pulled up a case study that was now historical. An A-10 pilot in 2005 who'd circled a downed pilot for 19 minutes, who'd survived an ambush that killed her squadron mates, who'd uncovered an intelligence operation and changed how the Air Force thought about operations in denied airspace. Alina studied the footage, grainy now by modern standards but still powerful, reading the analysis and learning the lessons that had been refined over decades. "The technology's different," Major Chen said, "but the principles are the same. When it matters, when lives depend on your decisions, you'll reach for the fundamentals: training, judgment, character." Colonel Vasquez proved that competence and courage aren't about fitting a stereotype. They're about being prepared and refusing to quit when the situation demands more than you thought you could give. Alina nodded, absorbing the lesson, unaware that the thread of transmission stretched back through Major Chen to his grandmother to the colonel herself, an unbroken chain of mentorship and mutual obligation that defined the service at its best. That night, thousands of miles from where Vasquez was buried, in a country she'd never visited, pilots launched on missions she'd helped make safer through her service and sacrifice. They flew with confidence built on the accumulated wisdom of generations, with technology purchased through decades of innovation, with tactics refined through countless missions and hard-won lessons. They didn't think about Colonel Vasquez. Most had never heard her name, knew nothing of that morning in the Afghan valley. But they flew in the wake of her legacy, beneficiaries of the changes she'd fought for, the culture she'd helped transform, the example she'd set of what service actually meant. And somewhere in the complex web of cause and effect that connects past to present, in the invisible lines that tie one generation's sacrifice to another's success, her influence persisted. Not in monuments or memorials, though those existed. Not in stories told and retold until they became myth, though those persisted too. But in the quiet competence of pilots doing their jobs, in the institutional wisdom that kept them safer, in the culture that judged them by their merit rather than their conformity to outdated stereotypes. That was the real legacy. Not one mission, however dramatic, but the long arc of service that followed, the decades of incremental progress, the generations of pilots trained and inspired. That was the obligation of survival transformed into the gift of mentorship, the weight of memory converted into the momentum of progress. The sun set over the mountains she'd loved, painting the sky in colors that evoked every dawn she'd watched from a cockpit, every evening she'd returned safely when safety wasn't guaranteed. The sky was unchanged, patient, eternal, the stage upon which human dramas played out in brief flashes before fading into history. But the sky remembered in its way every aircraft that had crossed it, every pilot who'd looked up with wonder or determination or fear. And if memory could be said to have weight, if the accumulated experience of millions of flights and thousands of pilots added up to something more than the sum of its parts, then somewhere in that vast emptiness, in the space between Earth and heaven where aircraft traced temporary lines across infinite blue, Colonel Myra Vasquez, call sign Gravedigger, was still flying. Not literally. The physical ended as all physical things must. But in the sense that mattered, in the transmission of wisdom and values and unbreakable commitment to something larger than self, she remained aloft, carried forward by those she'd taught, honored by those she'd inspired, remembered by an institution she'd helped transform. The final entry in her personal journal, found after her death and shared with her family's permission, read simply, "I wanted to fly and I did. I wanted to serve and I did. I wanted my life to matter, to make a difference, to leave the world better than I found it. I don't know if I succeeded, but I know I tried every day with everything I had. That will have to be enough." It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.